The story of the young king of the Black Isles. You must know, sire, that my father was Mohammed, the king of this country, the Black Isles, so called from the 4 mountains, which were once islands, while the capital was the place where the great lake now lies. My story will tell you how these changes came about. My father died when he was 66, and I succeeded him. I married my cousin, whom I loved tenderly, and I thought she loved me too. But one afternoon, when I was half asleep, and being fanned by 2 of her maids, I heard one say to the other, "What a pity it is that our mistress no longer loves our master. I believe she would like to kill him if she could, for she is an enchantress." I soon found by watching that they were right, and when I mortally wounded a favorite slave of hers for a great crime, she begged that she might build a palace in the garden, where she wept and bewailed him for 2 years. At last I begged her to cease grieving for him, for although he could no longer speak or move, by her enchantments she kept him alive. She turned upon me in a rage, and said over me some magic words, and I instantly became as you see me now, half man and half marble. Then this wicked enchantress changed the capital, which is a very populous and flourishing city, into the lake and desert plain you saw. The fish of 4 colors which are in it are the different races who lived in the town. The 4 hills are the 4 islands which gave the name to my kingdom. All this the enchantress told me to add to my troubles. And this is not all. Every day she comes and beats me with a whip of buffalo hide. When the young king had finished his sad story, he burst once more into tears, and the Sultan was much moved. "Tell me," he cried, "where is this wicked woman, and where is this miserable object of her affection, whom she just manages to keep alive?" "Where she lives I do not know," answered the unhappy prince, "but she goes every day at sunrise to see if the slave can yet speak to her after she has beaten me." "Unfortunate king," said the Sultan, "I will do what I can to avenge you." So he consulted with the young king over the best way to bring this about, and they agreed their plan should be put into effect the very next day. The Sultan then rested, and the young king gave himself up to happy hopes of release. The next day the Sultan arose, and went to the palace in the garden where the black slave was. He drew his sword and destroyed the little life that remained in him, then threw the body down a well. He then lay down on the couch where the slave had been, and waited for the enchantress. She went first to the young king, whom she beat with 100 blows. She then came to the room where she thought her wounded slave was, but where the Sultan really lay. She came near his couch and said, "Are you better today, my dear slave? Speak but one word to me." "How can I be better?" answered the Sultan, imitating the language of the Ethiopians, "when I can never sleep for the cries and groans of your husband?" "What joy it is to hear you speak," answered the queen. "Do you wish him to regain his proper shape?" "Yes," said the Sultan. "Hasten to set him at liberty, so that I may no longer hear his cries." The queen at once set out to take a cup of water, and said over it some words that made it boil as if it were on fire. She then threw it over the prince, who at once regained his own form. He was filled with joy, but the enchantress said, "Hasten away from this place and never come back, lest I kill you." So he hid himself to see the end of the Sultan's plan. The enchantress went back to the Palace of Tears and said, "Now I have done what you wished." "What you have done," said the Sultan, "is not enough to cure me. Every day at midnight all the people whom you have changed into fish lift their heads out of the lake and cry for vengeance. Go quickly and give them their proper shape." The enchantress hurried away and said some words over the lake. The fish then became men, women, and children, and the houses and shops were once more filled. The Sultan's suite, who had encamped by the lake, were not a little astonished to seat themselves in the middle of a large and beautiful town. As soon as she had disenchanted it, the queen went back to the palace. "Are you quite well now?" she said. "Come near," said the Sultan. "Nearer still." She obeyed. Then he sprang up, and with one blow of his sword he cut her in 2. He then went and found the prince. "Rejoice," he said, "your cruel enemy is dead." The prince then thanked him again and again. "And now," said the Sultan, "I will go back to my capital, which I am glad to find is so near yours." "So near mine," said the king of the Black Isles. "Do you know it is a whole year's journey from here? You came here in a few hours because it was enchanted. but I will accompany you on your journey." "It will give me much pleasure if you will escort me," said the Sultan, "and as I have no children, I will make you my heir." The Sultan and the prince set out together, the Sultan laden with rich presents from the King of the Black Isles. The day after he reached his capital, the Sultan assembled his court and told them all that had befallen him, told them how he intended to adopt the young king as his heir. He then gave each man presents in proportion to his rank. As for the fisherman, as he was the first cause of the deliverance of the young prince, the Sultan gave him much money, and made him and his family happy for the rest of their days. The story of the 3 calendars, sons of kings, and of 5 ladies of Baghdad. In the reign of the Caliph Harun al-Rashid, there lived at Baghdad a porter who, in spite of his humble calling, was an intelligent and sensible man. One morning he was sitting in his usual place with his basket before him, waiting to be hired, when a tall young lady covered with a long muslin veil came up to him and said, "Pick up your basket and follow me." The porter, who was greatly pleased by her appearance and voice, jumped up at once, poised his basket on his head, and accompanied the lady, saying to himself as he went, "Oh, happy day! Oh, lucky meeting!" The lady soon stopped before a closed door, at which she knocked. It was opened by an old man with a long white beard, to whom the lady held out money without speaking. The old man, who seemed to understand what she wanted, vanished into the house and returned bringing a large jar of wine, which the porter placed in his basket. Then the lady signed to him to follow, and they went their way. The next place she stopped was at a fruit and flower shop, and here she brought a large quantity of apples, apricots, peaches, and other things, with lilies, jasmine, and all sorts of sweet-smelling plants. From this shop she went to a butcher's, a grocer's, and a poulterer's, till at last the porter exclaimed in despair, "My good lady, if you had only told me you were going to buy enough provisions to stock a town, I would have brought a horse, or rather a camel." The lady laughed, and told him she had not finished yet, but after choosing various kinds of scents and spices from a druggist's store, she halted before a magnificent palace, at the door of which she knocked gently. The porter, as who opened it, was of such beauty that the eyes of the man were quite dazzled, and he was more astonished as he saw clearly that she was no slave. The lady who led him hither stood watching him with amusement, till the portress exclaimed, "Why don't you come in, my sister? This poor man is so heavily weighed down that he is ready to drop." When they were both inside, the door was fastened, and all 3 entered a large court surrounded by an open-work gallery. At one end of the court was a platform, and on the platform stood an amber throne supported by 4 ebony columns, garnished with pearls and diamonds. In the middle of the court stood a marble basin filled with water from the mouth of a golden lion. The porter looked about him, noticing and admiring everything, but his attention was specially attracted by a 3rd lady sitting on the throne, who was even more beautiful than the other 2. But the respect shown her by the others, he judged that she might be the eldest, and in this he was right. This lady's name was Zobeida, and the porteress was Sadie, and the housekeeper was Amina. At a word from Zobeida, Sadie and Amina took the basket from the porter. He was glad enough to be relieved from its weight, and when it was emptied, paid him handsomely for its use. But instead of taking up his basket and going away, the man still lingered till Zobeida inquired what he was waiting for, and if he expected more money. "Oh, madame," returned he, "you have already given me too much, and I fear I may have been guilty of rudeness in not taking my departure at once. But if you will pardon me saying so, I was so lost in astonishment at seeing beautiful ladies by themselves. A company of women without men, however, is as dull of a company as a company of men without women." After telling some stories to prove his point, he ended by entreating them to let him stay and make a 4th at their dinner. The ladies were rather amused at the man's assurances, and after some discussion, it was agreed that he should be allowed to stay, as his society might prove entertaining. "But listen, friend," said Zobeida. "If we grant your request, it is only on condition that you behave with the utmost politeness, and that you keep the secret of our way of living which chance has revealed to you." Then they all sat down to table, which had been covered by Amina with the dishes she had brought. At the first few mouthfuls, Amina poured some wine into a golden cup. She first drank herself, according to the Arab custom, then filled it for her sisters. When it came time to the porter's turn, he kissed Amina's hands and sang a song which he composed at the moment in praise of the wine. The three ladies were pleased with the song and then sang themselves, so that the repast was a merry one, and lasted much longer than usual. At length, seeing that the sun was about to set, Sadia said to the porter, "Rise and go, it is now time for us to separate." "Oh, madame," replied he, "how can you desire me to quit you in the state which I am? Between the wine I have drunk and the pleasure of seeing you, I should never find the way to my house. Let me remain here until morning, and when I have recovered my senses, I will go when you like." "Let him stay," said Amina, who had before proved herself his friend. "It is only just, as he has given us so much amusement." "If you wish it, my sister," replied Zobeida, "but if he does, I must make a new condition. Porter, she continued, turning to him, "if you remain, you must promise to ask no questions about anything which you may see. If you do, you may perhaps hear what you don't like." This means settled, Amina brought in supper, and lit up the hall with a number of sweet-smelling tapers. They then sat down again at the table, and began with fresh appetites to eat, drink, sing, and recite verses. In fact, they were all enjoying themselves mightily when they heard a knock at the outer door, which Sadie rose to open. She then returned, saying that the three calendars, all blind in the right eye, and all with their heads, faces, and eyebrows cleanly shaved, begged for admittance, as they were newly arrived in Baghdad and night had already fallen. They seemed to have pleasant manners, she added, but you have no idea how funny they look. I am sure we would find their company diverting. Zobeida and Amina made some difficulty about admitting the newcomers, and Sadie knew the reason of their hesitation, but she urged the matter so strongly that Zobeida was at last forced to consent. "Bring them in," she said, "but make them understand that they are not to make remarks about what does not concern them, and be sure to make them read the inscription over the door." For on the door was written in letters of gold, "Whoso meddles in affairs that are no business of his will hear truths that will not please him." The three calendars bowed low on entering, and thanked the ladies for their kindness and hospitality. The ladies replied with words of welcome, and they were all about to seat themselves, when the eyes of the calendar fell on the porter, whose dress was not so very unlike their own, though he still wore all the hair that nature had given them. "This," said one of them, "is apparently one of our Arab brothers, who has rebelled against our rulers." The porter, although half asleep from the wine he had drunk, heard the words, and without moving cried angrily to the calendar, "Sit down and mind your own business. Did you not read the inscription over the door? Everybody is not obliged to live in the same way." "Do not be so angry, my good man," replied the calendar. "We should be very sorry to displease you." So the quarrel was smoothed over, and supper began in good earnest. When the calendars had satisfied their hunger, they offered to play to their hostesses, if there were any instruments in the house. The ladies were delighted at the idea, and Sadie went to see what she could find, returning in a few moments laden with 2 different kinds of flutes and a tambourine. Each calendar took the one he preferred, and began to play a well-known air while the ladies sang the words of the song. These words were the gayest and liveliest possible, and every now and then the singers had to stop to indulge the laughter which almost choked them. In the midst of all their noise, a knock was heard at the door. Now early that evening the Caliph secretly left the palace, accompanied by his Grand Vizier Ghaffar and Masroor, chief of the eunuchs, all 3 wearing the dresses of merchants. Passing down the street, the Caliph had been attracted by the music of instruments and the sound of laughter, and had ordered his vizier to go and knock at the door of the house as he wished to enter. The vizier replied that the ladies who lived there seemed to be entertaining their friends, and he thought his master would do well not to intrude on them, but the Caliph had taken it into his head to see for himself, and insisted on being obeyed. The knock was answered by Sadie with a taper in her hand, and the vizier was surprised at her beauty, bowed low before her, and said respectfully, "Madame, we are 3 merchants who have lately arrived from Mosul, and owing to a misadventure which befell us this night, only reached our inn to find the doors were closed to us until tomorrow morning. Not knowing what to do, we wandered in the streets till we happened to pass your house. When seeing lights and hearing the sound of voices, we are resolved to ask you to give us shelter until the dawn. If you will grant us this favor, we will, with your permission, do all in our powers to help you spend the time pleasantly." Sadie answered the merchant that she must first consult with her sisters, and after having talked over the matter with them, she returned to tell him that he and his 2 friends would be welcome to join their company. They entered and bowed politely to the ladies and their guests. Then Zobeida, as the mistress, came forward and said gravely, "You are welcome here, but I hope you will allow me to beg one thing of you. Have as many eyes as you would like, but no tongues, and ask no questions about anything you see, however strange it may appear to you." "Madame," returned the vizier, "you shall be obeyed. We have quite enough to please and interest us without troubling ourselves about that which we have no concern." Then they all sat down and drank to the health of the newcomers. When the vizier Ghaffar was talking to the ladies, the caliph was occupied in wondering who they could be, and why the 3 calendars had each lost his right eye. He was burning to inquire the reason of it all, but was silenced by Zobeida's request, so he tried to rouse himself and take his part in the conversation, which was very lively, the subject of discussion being the many sort of pleasures that there were in the world. After some time the calendars got up and performed some curious dances, which delighted the rest of the company. When they had finished, Zobeida rose from her seat, and taking Amina by the hand, she said to her, "My sister, our friends will excuse us if we seem to forget their presence and fulfill our nightly task." Amina understood her sister's meaning, and collecting the dishes, glasses, and musical instruments, she carried them away, while Sadie swept the hall and put everything in order. Having done this, she begged the calendars to sit on a sofa on one side of the room, and the caliph and his friend to place them on opposite. As to the porter, she requested him to come and help her and her sister. Shortly after, Amina entered carrying a seat, which she put down in the middle of the empty space. She went next over to the door of a closet and signed to the porter to follow her. He did so, and soon reappeared leading 2 black dogs by a chain, which he brought into the center of the hall. Zobeida then got up from her seat between the calendars and the caliph, and walked slowly across to where the porter stood with the dogs. "We must do our duty," she said with a deep sigh, pushing back her sleeves and taking a whip from Sadie. She said to the man, "Take one of these dogs to my sister Amina and give me the other." The porter did as he was bid, but as he led the dog to Zobeida, it uttered piercing howls and gazed up at her with looks of entreaty. But Zobeida took no notice and whipped the dog until she was out of breath. She then took the chain from the porter, and raising the dog on its hind legs, they looked into each other's eyes sorrowfully, until tears began to fall from both. Then Zobeida took her handkerchief and wiped the dog's eyes tenderly, after which she kissed it. Then, putting the chain back into the porter's hands, she said, "Take it back to the closet and bring me the other." The same ceremony was gone through with the second dog, and all the while the whole company looked on with astonishment. Then the caliph in particular could hardly contain himself, and made signs to the vizier to ask what it all meant. But the vizier pretended not to see, and turned his head away. Zobeida remained for some time in the middle of the room, till at last Sadie went up to her and begged her to sit down, as she also had her part to play. At these words, Amina fetched a lute from a case of yellow satin and gave it to Sadie, who sang several songs to its accompaniment. When she was tired, she said to Amina, "My sister, I can do no more. Come, I pray you, and take my place." Amina struck a few chords, then broke into a song, which she sang with so much ardor that she was quite overcome, and sank gasping on a pile of cushions. tearing open her dress as she did so to give herself some air. To the amazement of all present, her neck, instead of being smooth and white as her face, was a mass of scars. The calender and the caliph looked at each other and whispered together, unheard by Zobeida and Sadie, who were tending to their fainting sister. "What does it all mean?" asked the caliph. "We know no more than you," asked the calender to whom he had spoken. "What? You do not belong to the house?" "My lord," answered all the calenders, "we came here for the first time just an hour before you." Then they turned to the porter to see if he could explain the mystery, but the porter was no wiser than they were themselves. At length the caliph could contain his curiosity no longer, and declared that he would compel the ladies to tell them the meaning of their strange conduct. The vizier, foreseeing what would happen, implored him to remember the condition their hostesses had imposed, and added in a whisper that if His Highness would only wait until morning, as he could, Caliph would summon the ladies to appear before him. But the Caliph, who was not accustomed to be contradicted, rejected this advice, and it was resolved after a little more talking that the question should be put by the porter. Suddenly Zobeida turned round, and seeing their excitement, she said, "What is the matter? What are you all discussing so earnestly?" "Madam," answered the porter, "these gentlemen entreat you to explain to themselves why you should first whip the dogs and then cry over them, and also how it happens that the fainting lady is covered with scars. They have requested me, madam, to be their mouthpiece." "Is it true, gentlemen," asked Zobeida, drawing herself up, "that you have charged this man to put me this question?" "It is," they all replied, except for Ghaffar, who was silent. "Is this," continued Zobeida, growing more angry every moment, "is this the return you make me for the hospitality I have shown you? Have you forgotten the one condition on which you were allowed to enter the house? Come quickly," she added, clapping her hands 3 times. The words were hardly uttered when 7 black slaves, each armed with a saber, burst in and stood over the 7 men, throwing them on the ground and preparing themselves on a sign from their mistress to cut off their heads. The 7 culprits all thought their last hour had come, and the caliph repented bitterly that he had not taken the vizier's advice. But they made up their minds to die bravely, all except the porter, who loudly inquired of Zobeida why he was to suffer for other people's faults, and declared that if these misfortunes had never happened, would never have happened if it were not for the calenders, who always brought ill luck. He ended by imploring Zobeida not to confound the innocent with the guilty, and to spare his life. In spite of her anger, there was something so comic in the groans of the porter that Zobeida could not refrain from laughing. By putting him aside, she addressed the others a second time, saying, "Answer me, who are you? Unless you tell me, you truly have not another moment to live. I can hardly believe that you are men of any position, whatever country you belong to. If you were, you would have more consideration for us." The caliph, who was naturally very impatient, suffered far more than either of the others at feeling that his life was at the mercy of a justly offended lady. But when he heard her question, he began to breathe more freely, for he was convinced that she had to learn his name and rank for all danger to be over. So he whispered hastily to the vizier, who was next to him, to reveal their secret. But the vizier, wiser than his master, wished to conceal from the public the affront they had received, and merely answered, "After all, we had only got what we deserved." Meanwhile, Zobeida had turned to the 3 calenders and inquired if, as they were all blind, they were brothers. "No, madam," replied one, "we are no blood relations at all, only brothers by our mode of life." "And you," she asked, addressing one another, "were you born blind of one eye?" "No, madam," returned he, "I became blind through a most surprising adventure, such as probably never happened to anyone. After that I shaved my head and eyebrows and put on the dress in which you see me now." Zobeida put the same question to the other 2 calenders and received the same answer. "But," added the 3rd one, "it may interest you, madam, to know that we are not men of low birth, but are all 3 sons of kings, and of kings too, whom the world holds in high esteem." At these words Zobeida's anger cooled down, and she turned to her slaves and said, "You can give them a little more liberty, but do not leave the hall. Those that will tell us their histories and their reasons for coming here shall be allowed to leave unhurt. Those who refused," she paused, but in only a moment, to the porter, who understood that he had only to relate his story to set himself free from the danger, immediately broke in. Madame, you already know how I came here. What I will have to say will soon be told. Your sister found me this morning in the place where I always stand waiting to be hired. She bade me to follow her to various shops, and when my basket was quite full, we returned to this house, when you had the goodness to permit me to remain, for which I will be eternally grateful. That is my story." He looked anxiously to Zobeida, who nodded her head and said, "You can go, and take great care we never meet again." "Oh, madame," cried the porter, "let me stay yet a little while. It is not just that the others should have heard my story, and that I should not hear theirs." And without waiting for permission, he seated himself on the end of the sofa occupied by the ladies, whilst the rest crouched on the carpet, and the slaves stood against the wall. Then one of the calenders, addressing himself to Zobeida as the principal lady, began his story. The story of the first calender, son of a king. "In order, madam, to explain how I came to lose my right eye and to wear the dress of a calender, you must first know that I am the son of a king. My father's only brother reigned over the neighboring country and had 2 children, a daughter and a son, who were of the same age of myself. As I grew up and was allowed more liberty, I went every year to pay a visit to my uncle's court, and usually stayed there about 2 months. This way my cousin and I became very intimate and were very much attached to each other. The very last time I saw him, he seemed more delighted to see me than ever, and gave me a great feast in my honor. When we had finished eating, he said to me, 'My cousin, you would never guess what I've been doing since your last visit to us. Directly after your departure, I sent a number of men to work on a building of my own design. It is now completed and ready to be lived in. I should like to show it to you, but you must first swear 2 things. Be faithful to me, and keep my secret.' Of course, I did not dream of refusing him anything he asked, and gave the promise without the least hesitation. He then bade me to wait an instant, and vanished, returning in a few moments with a richly dressed lady of great beauty, but as he did not tell me her name, I thought it was better not to inquire. We all 3 sat down to table, and amused ourselves with talking of all sorts of different things, with drinking each other's health. Suddenly the prince said to me, 'Cousin, we have no time to lose. Be so kind as to conduct this lady to a certain spot where you will find a dome-like tomb, newly built. You cannot mistake it. Go in, both of you, and wait till I come. I shall not be long.' As I had promised, I prepared to do as I was told, and gave my hand to the lady. I escorted her by the light of the moon to the place of which the prince had spoken. We barely reached it when he joined us himself, carrying a small vessel of water, a pickaxe, and a little bag containing plaster. With the pickaxe he at once began destroying the empty sepulchre in the middle of the tomb. One by one he took the stones and piled them in a corner. When he had knocked down the whole sepulchre, he proceeded to dig at the earth, and beneath where the sepulchre had been, I saw a trapdoor. He raised the door, and I caught sight of the top of a spiral staircase. Then he said, turning to the lady, 'Madame, this is the way that will lead you down to the spot of which I told you of.' The lady did not answer, but silently descended the staircase, the prince following her. At the top, however, he looked at me. 'My cousin,' he exclaimed, 'I do not know how to thank you for your kindness. Farewell.' 'What do you mean?' I cried. 'I don't understand.' 'No matter,' he replied. 'Go back by the path which you came.' He would say no more, and greatly puzzled, I returned to my room in the palace and went to bed. When I awoke and considered my adventure, I thought that I must have been dreaming, and sent a servant to ask if the prince was dressed and could see me. But on hearing that he had not slept at home, I was much alarmed, and hastened to the cemetery, where unluckily the tombs were all alike, that I could not discover which one was the one I was in search of, though I spent 4 days in looking for it. You must know that in all this time the king, my uncle, was absent on a hunting expedition, so no one knew when he would be back, and I at last decided to return home, leaving the ministers to make my excuses. I longed to tell them what had become of the prince, about whose fates they felt the most dreadful anxiety, but the oath I had sworn kept me silent. On my arrival at my father's capital, I was astonished to find a large detachment of guards drawn up before the gate of the palace, and they surrounded me directly as I entered. I asked the officer in command the reason of this strange behavior, and was horrified to learn that the army had mutinied and put to death the king, my father, and had placed the Grand Vizier on the throne. Further by his orders, I was placed under arrest. Now this rebel vizier had hated me from my boyhood because once, when shooting at a bird with a bow, I had shot out his eye by accident. Of course, I had not only sent a servant at once to offer him my regrets and apologies, but I had made them in person. It was all of no use. He cherished an undying hatred towards me, and lost no occasion of showing it. Having once got me in his power, I felt he could show me no mercy, and I was right. Mad with triumph and fury, he came to me in my prison and tore out my right eye. That is how I lost it. My persecutor, however, did not stop there. He shut me up in a large case and ordered his executioner to carry me into a desert place, to cut off my head, and then abandon my body to the birds of prey. This case, with me inside it, was accordingly placed on a horse, and the executioner, accompanied by another man, rode into the country until they found a spot suitable for the purpose, but their hearts were not so hard as they seemed, and my tears and prayers made them waver. "Forsake the kingdom instantly," said the executioner at last, "and take care to never come back, for you will not only lose your head, but make us lose ours." I thanked him gratefully, and tried to console myself for the loss of my eye by thinking of the other misfortunes I had escaped. After all I had gone through, and my fear of being recognized by some enemy, I could only travel very slowly and very cautiously, generally resting in some out-of-the-way place by day, and walking as far as I was able by night. But at length I arrived in the kingdom of my uncle, of whose protection I was sure. I found him in great trouble about the disappearance of his son, who he had said vanished without leaving a trace, but his own grief did not prevent him sharing mine. We mingled our tears, for the loss of one was the loss of the other, and then I made up my mind that it was my duty to break the solemn oath I had sworn to the prince. I therefore lost no time in telling my uncle everything I knew. I observed that before I had even entered, his sorrow seemed to be lightened a little. "My dear uncle, my dear nephew," he said, "your story gives me some hope. I was aware that my son was building a tomb, and I think I can find the spot. But as you wish to keep the matter secret, let us go alone and seek the place ourselves." He then bade me to disguise myself, and we both slipped out of a garden door that opened onto the cemetery. It did not take long for us to arrive at the scene of the prince's disappearance, or to discover the tomb I had sought so vainly before. We entered it, and found the trapdoor which led to the staircase, but we had great difficulty in raising it, because the prince had fastened it down underneath with the plaster he had brought with him. My uncle went first, and I followed him. When we reached the bottom of the staircase, we stepped into some sort of ante-room, filled with such a dense smoke that it was hardly possible to see anything. However, we passed through the smoke into a large chamber, which at first seemed quite empty. The room was brilliantly lit. In another moment we perceived a sort of platform at one end, on which were the bodies of the prince and a lady, both half burned, as if they had been dragged out of a fire before it had quite consumed them. This horrible sight turned me faint, but to my surprise my uncle did not show so much surprise as anger. I knew, he said, that my son was tenderly attached to this lady, whom it was impossible he should ever marry. I tried to turn his thoughts and present him the most beautiful princesses, but he cared for none of them. As you see, they have now been united by a horrible death in an underground tomb. But as he spoke, his anger melted into tears, and again I wept with him. When he recovered himself, he drew me to him. "My dear nephew," he said, embracing me, "you have come to me to take his place, and I will do my best to forget that I ever had a son who could act in such a wicked manner." He then turned and went up the stairs. We reached the palace without anyone having noticed our absence, when shortly after a clashing of drums and cymbals and the blare of trumpets burst upon our astonished ears. At the same time a thick cloud of dust on the horizon told of the approach of a great army. My heart sank when I perceived that the commander was the vizier who had dethroned my father and was coming to seize the kingdom of my uncle. The capital was utterly unprepared to stand a siege, and seeing that resistance was useless, at once opened its gates. My uncle fought hard for his life, but was soon overpowered, and when he fell I managed to escape through a secret passage, and took refuge with an officer I knew I could trust. Persecuted by ill fortune and stricken with grief, there seemed to be only one means of safety left to me. I shaved my beard and my eyebrows, and put on the dress of a calender, in which it was easy for me to travel without being known. I avoided the towns until I reached the kingdom of the famous and powerful Caliph Harun al-Rashid, which I had no reason when I had no further reason to fear my enemies. It was my intention to come to Baghdad and throw myself at the feet of His Highness, who I felt certain, be touched by my sad story, and would grant me, beside his help and his protection. After a journey which lasted some months, I arrived at length at the gates of the city. It was sunset, and I paused for a little to look about me, and decide which way to turn my steps. I was still debating on this subject when I was joined by this other calender, who stopped to greet me. "You, like me, appear to be a stranger," I said. He replied that I was right, and before he could say more, the third calender came up. He was also newly arrived to Baghdad, and being brothers in misfortune, we resolved to cast in our lots together, and to share whatever fate might have in store. By this time it had grown late, and we did not know where to spend the night, but our lucky star had guided us to this door. We took the liberty of knocking and asking for shelter, which was given to us at once with the best of grace in the world. This, madame, is my story. "I am satisfied," replied Zobeida. "You can go when you like." The calender, however, begged leave to stay put and hear the histories of his two friends and of the 3 other persons of the company, which he was allowed to do. The story of the second calender, the son of a king. "Madame," said the young man, addressing Zobeida, "if you wish to know how I lost my right eye, I shall have to tell you the story of my whole life. I was scarcely more than a baby when the king my father, finding me unusually quick and clever for my age, turned his thoughts to my education. I was taught first to read and write, then to learn the Koran, which is the basis of our holy religion, and the better to understand it, I read with my tutors the ablest commentators on its teaching, and committed to memory all the traditions respecting the Prophet which had been gathered from the mouth of those who were his friends. I also learnt history, and was instructed in poetry, versification, geography, chronology, and all the outdoor exercises in which every prince should excel. But what I liked best of all was writing Arabic characters, and in this I soon surpassed my masters, and gained a reputation in this branch of knowledge that reached as far as India itself. Now the Sultan of the Indies, curious to see a young prince with such strange tastes, sent an ambassador to my father, laden with rich presents and a warm invitation to visit his court. My father, who was deeply anxious to secure the friendship of so powerful a monarch, and held besides that a little travel would greatly improve my manners and open my mind, accepted gladly, and in a short time I had set out for India with the ambassador, attended only by a small suite on account of the length of the journey, and the badness of the roads. However, as was my duty, I took with me 10 camels, laden with rich presents for the Sultan. We had been traveling for about a month, when one day we saw a cloud of dust moving swiftly toward us, and as it came near, we found that the dust concealed a band of 50 robbers. Our men barely numbered half, so we were also hampered by the camels. There was no use in fighting, so we tried to overawe them by informing them who we were and whither we were going. The robbers, however, only laughed and declared that was none of their business. Without more words, attacked us brutally. I defended myself to the last, wounded though I was, but at length, seeing that the resistance was hopeless, and that the ambassador and all our followers were made prisoners, I put spurs to my horse and rode away as fast as I could, till the poor beast fell dead from a wound in his side. I managed to jump off without any injury, and looked as if I was about to see if I was pursued. But for the moment I was safe, for however I imagined, the robbers were all engaged in quarrelling over their booty. I found myself in a country that was quite new to me, and dared not to return to the main road, lest I fall again to the hands of the robbers. Luckily my wound was only a slight one, and after binding it up well as I could, I walked on for the rest of the day till I reached a cave at the foot of a mountain, where I passed the night in peace, making my supper off some fruits I had gathered on the way. I wandered about for a whole month without knowing where I was going, till at last I found myself on the outskirts of a beautiful city, watered by winding streams, which enjoyed an eternal spring. My delight at the prospect of mixing once more with human beings, was somewhat damped at the thought of the miserable object I must see. My hands and face had been burned nearly black, my clothes were all in rags, and my shoes were in such a state that I had been forced to abandon them altogether. I entered the town and stopped at a tailor's shop to inquire where I was. The man saw I was better than my condition and begged me to sit down, and in return I told him my whole story. The tailor listened with attention, but his reply, instead of giving me consolation, only increased my trouble. "Beware," he said, "of telling anyone what you have just told me, for the prince who governs this kingdom is your father's greatest enemy, and he would be rejoiced to find you in his power." I thanked the tailor for his counsel, and said I would do whatever he advised. Then, being very hungry, I gladly ate all of the food he put before me, and accepted his offer of a lodging in his house. In a few days I had quite recovered from the hardships I had undergone, and the tailor, knowing that it was the custom for the princes of our religion to learn a trade or profession so as to provide themselves in times of ill fortune, inquired if there was anything I could do for my living. I replied that I had been educated as a grammarian and a poet, but that my great gift was writing. "All of that is no use here," said the tailor. "Take my advice. Put on a short coat, and as you seem hardy and strong, go into the woods and cut firewood, for you will sell in the streets. By this means you will earn your living, and will be able to wait until better times come. The hatchet and the cord shall be my present." This counsel was very distasteful to me, but I thought I could do no otherwise than adopt it. So the next morning I set out with a company of poor woodcutters to whom the tailor had introduced me. Even on the first day I cut enough wood to sell for a tolerable sum, and soon I became more expert, and had made enough money to repay the tailor all that he had lent me. I had been a woodcutter for more than a year, when one day I wandered further into the forest than I had ever done before, and reached a delicious green glade, where I began to cut wood. I was hacking at the root of a tree when I beheld an iron ring fastened to a trapdoor of the same metal. I soon cleared away the earth, and pulling up the door, found a staircase, which I hastily made up my mind to go down, carrying my hatchet with me by way of protection. When I reached the bottom, I discovered that I was in a huge palace, as brilliantly lighted as any palace above ground that I had ever seen, with a long gallery supported by pillars of jasper ornamented with capitals of gold. Down this gallery a lady came to meet me, of such beauty that I forgot everything else and thought only of her. To save her all the trouble possible, I hastened toward her and bowed low. "Who are you? Who are you?" she said. "A man or a genie?" "A man, madame," I replied. "I have nothing to do with genie." "By what accident do you come here?" she asked again with such a sigh. "I have been in this place now for 25 years, and you are the first man who has visited me." Emboldened by her beauty and gentleness, I ventured to reply, "Before, madam, I answer your question, allow me to say how grateful I am for this meeting, which is not only in consolation to me in my own heavy sorrow, but may perhaps enable me to render your lot happier." Then I told her who I was and how I had come there. "Alas, prince," she said with a deeper sigh than before, "you have guessed rightly in supposing me an unwilling prisoner in this gorgeous palace. I am the daughter of the king of the Ebony Isle, of whose fame you surely must have heard. At my father's desire I was married to a prince who was my own cousin, but on my very wedding day I was snatched up by a genie and brought here in a faint. For a long while I did nothing but weep, and would not suffer the genie to come near me, but time teaches us submission, and I have now got accustomed to his presence, and if clothes and jewels could content me, I have them in plenty. Every 10th day for 25 years I have received a visit from him, but in case I should need his help at any other time, I have only to touch a talisman that stands at the entrance of my chamber. It wants still 5 days to his next visit, and I hope during that time you will do me the honor to be my guest." I was much too dazzled by her beauty to dream of refusing her offer. Accordingly, the princess had me conducted to the bath, and a rich dress befitting my rank was provided to me. Then a feast of the most delicate dishes was served in a room hung with embroidered Indian fabrics. Next day, when we were at dinner, I could maintain my patience no longer, implored the princess to break her bonds and return with me to the world which was lighted by the sun. "What you ask is impossible," she answered, "but stay here with me instead, and we can be happy, and all you will have to do is betake yourself to the forest every 10th day when I am expecting my master, the genie. He is very jealous, as you know, and will not suffer a man to come near me." "Princess," I replied, "I see it is only fear of the genie that makes you act like this. For myself, I dread him so little that I mean to break his talisman into pieces. Awful though you think him, he shall feel the weight of my arm, and I herewith take a solemn vow to stamp out the whole race." The princess, who realized the consequences of such audacity, entreated me not to touch the talisman. "If you do, it will be the ruin of both of us," said she. "I know Genie much better than you." But the wine I had drunk confused my brain. I gave one kick to the talisman, and it fell into 1,000 pieces. Hardly had my foot touched the talisman when the air became dark as night, a fearful noise was heard, and the whole palace was shook to its very foundations. In an instant I was sobered and understood what I had done. "Princess," I cried, "what is happening?" "Alas," she exclaimed, forgetting all her terrors and anxiety for me, "fly, or you are lost." I followed her advice and dashed up the staircase, leaving my hatchet behind me. But I was too late. The palace opened, and the genie appeared, who turned angrily to the princess and asked indignantly, "What is the matter that you have sent for me like this?" "A pain in my heart," she replied hastily, obliging me to seek the aid of this little bottle. Feeling faint, I slipped and fell against the talisman, which was broke. "This is really all." "You are impudent liar," cried the genie. "How did this hatchet and these shoes get here?" "I never saw them before," she answered, "and you came in such a hurry that you may have picked them up on the road without knowing it." To this the genie replied only by insults and blows. I could hear the shrieks and groans of the princess, and having by this time taken off my rich garments and put on those in which I had arrived the previous day, I lifted the trap, found myself once more in the forest, and returned to my friend the tailor with a light load of wood and a heart full of shame and sorrow. The tailor, which had been uneasy at my long absence, was delighted to see me, but I kept silence about my adventure, and as soon as possible retired to my room to lament in secret over my folly. While I was thus indulging in my grief, my host entered and said, "There's an old man downstairs who has brought your hatchet and slippers, which he picked up on the road, and now restores to you, as he found them out from one of your comrades where you lived. You had better come down and speak to him yourself." At this speech I changed color, and my legs trembled underneath me. The tailor noticed my confusion, and was going to inquire the reason, when the door of the room opened, and the old man appeared, carrying with him my hatchet and shoes. "I am a genie," he said, "the son of the daughter of Eblis, the prince of the genii. Is this hatchet not yours, and these shoes?" Without waiting for an answer, which indeed I could hardly have given him, so great was my fright, he seized hold of me and darted into the air with the quickness of lightning, then with equal swiftness dropped down towards the earth. When he touched the ground, he rapped it open with his foot. It opened, and we found ourselves in the enchanted palace, in the presence of the beautiful princess of the Ebony Isle. But how different she looked from when I had seen her last, for she was lying stretched on the ground, covered with blood, and weeping bitterly. "Traitors," cried the genie, "is this man not your lover?" She lifted up her eyes slowly, and looked sadly at me. "I have never seen him before," she answered slowly. "I do not know who he is." "Wait," exclaimed the genie, "you owe all your sufferings to him, and yet you dare to say he is a stranger to you?" "But if he really is a stranger to me," she replied, "why should I tell a lie and cause his death?" "Very well," said the genie, drawing his sword. "Take this and cut off his head." "Alas," answered the princess, "I am too weak to even hold the saber. Supposing that the strength, why should I put an innocent man to death?" "You condemn yourself by your refusal," said the genie. Then turning to me, he added, "And you, do you not even know her?" "How should I?" replied, resolving to imitate the princess in her fidelity. "How should I, when I have never seen her before?" "Cut her head off, then, if she is a stranger to you, and I shall believe you are speaking the truth, and will set you at liberty." "Certainly," I answered, taking the saber in my hands, and making a sign to the princess to fear nothing, for as it was my own life that I was about to sacrifice, and not hers. But the look of gratitude she gave me shook my courage, and I flung the saber to the earth. "I should not deserve to live," I said to the genie, "if I were such a coward as to slay a lady who was not only unknown to me, but at the moment half dead herself. Do with me as you will, I am in your power, but I refuse to obey your cruel command." "I see," said the genie, "that you have both made up your minds to brave me, but I will give you a sample of what you may expect." So saying, with one sweep of his saber, he cut off a hand of the princess, who was just able to lift the other to wave me an eternal farewell. Then I lost consciousness for several minutes. When I came to myself, I implored the genie to keep me no longer in this state of suspense, but to lose no time in putting an end to my sufferings. The genie, however, paid no attention to my prayers, but said sternly, "This is the way in which a genie treats the woman who has betrayed him. If I choose, I could kill you also, but I will be merciful and content myself with changing you into a dog, an ass, a lion, or a bird, whichever you prefer." I caught myself eagerly at those words, as giving me a faint hope of softening his wrath. "O genie," I cried, "as you wish to spare my life, be generous and spare it together. Grant my prayer, grant my prayer, pardon my crime, as the best man in the whole world forgave his neighbor, who was eaten up with envy of him." Contrary to my hopes, the genie seemed interested in my words, and said he would like to hear the story of the two neighbors. "And I think, madame, it may please you. I will tell it to you also."